Multiplayer games can be some of the most fun you'll ever have with video games, but if you give gamers the choice between single player games and multiplayer games, most will choose single player games. So why is that? Well, the easiest answer is that it's just far more accessible. Most people will tell you that they either don't have enough friends or that the friends they do have can't just be coming over all the time to play games. Whatever the case may be, you've always got yourself if you want to play games, and so single player is there for you. It's a little deeper than that though. Single player video games allow the experience to be more personal for the player. By taking more of the variables away and only having one player making inputs that affect the game, the player has more control over what the experience will be. Multiplayer games are often just the game creators giving a tool set to a bunch of players to mess around with. This creates gameplay that is often more hectic, and while that can be fun, it makes for a different kind of experience. Of course, a lot of single player games could be described that way as well. Heck, just look at the Grand Theft Auto games and a lot of the open world games that became popular. However, while these games could certainly be described as giving the player a big toolbox of things to do, it's still just a single player doing it. This more personal dynamic allows the player to really get absorbed into the game, and with that can come a lot of enjoyment. Plus, if you want to tell any kind of story, it's almost necessary. If you think about some of the best stories and narratives ever told in video games, they're pretty much all single player games. Having a single player who is in control of pushing the pace and progression allows that player to better connect with the story. Not to mention you don't have to wait around for another player when you're ready to jump back into the game. Imagine if you were reading a book but you could only continue when your friend was around. They often have a lot of customization involved as well, letting the player make decisions that help further craft the experience into something more individual. Single player games tend to be more goal oriented. There's a purpose, something waiting at the end that you're working towards. Multiplayer games are typically some sort of competition where the winner will be determined within a reasonable amount of time in a single sitting. Compare this to single player games where there's usually a lot of stuff like progressing to new levels, character building, a story taking place, or what have you. That type of progression makes you really feel like you've accomplished something by the end of the game. I think for video games to be taken more seriously, they need to be able to have a profound impact on the player, and single player games are able to do that more regularly. Multiplayer tends to be described more along the lines of, yeah, that was a lot of fun, whereas people's favorite single player games often get described as, that's one of the best games I've ever played. The purpose of this video isn't to say that multiplayer games don't have their place, they absolutely do. But if you asked most gamers what their top 5 games of all time were, I can pretty much guarantee the majority of those games would be single player. As we make our way into more modern times, it's as important as ever that single player games remain relevant. We're seeing more and more multiplayer games that are being described as live services, which can certainly be a lot of fun in some cases. They can also suck too. And the problem with these games is they don't do much for the preservation of video games because once those servers are shut down, the game basically doesn't exist anymore. And sure, they can be remembered, but not being able to play them anymore is a huge letdown in my opinion. And coming from the mindset of a retro gamer, that sucks, because all these older games that are considered to be some of the greatest games ever made are still as playable as they were when they came out. When people go back to experience games from the PS4 and Xbox One generation, a huge chunk of the library will be unplayable. The games that will still be played from this generation will mostly be the games that had single player modes. Something I'd also like to mention is that it seems like more casual gamers seem to prefer multiplayer games at a higher rate than more serious gamers. I think this is because multiplayer includes a social aspect, which makes things feel more lighthearted by default. Unless you're playing Mario Party, that is. With single player games, you tend to need to be a little more serious about it since it requires a bigger investment to get all the way through it. Though there's certainly something to be said about competitive multiplayer at really high levels, requiring players to get very serious. Whatever the case may be, if you love video games enough, there's a good chance you'll want to invest in single player games because of how deep and rewarding they can be. Alright, so for this week's question, I'd like to hear what it is you like so much about single player games, and if you do happen to prefer multiplayer games over them, then I'd like to hear that as well. So leave those comments down below, and I will see ya in the next video.